Commence primary ignition.
I'm just not the hero type, clearly.
What a piece of junk.
Enterprise, this is the captain.
I got a bad feeling about this.
It's all part of the plan.
Engage.
Welcome back to Podcast 2 for 1. I'm your host, Donovan Thompson, with my co-host,
Daniel Wingfield.
And today we are joined by Dr. Bruce Hutchinson. Doctor.
Glad to be back once more.
Glad to have you. And today we are talking The Truman Show. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button, that notification bell. That way you're up to date on all future episodes of Podcast 2 for 1, as well as all the cool content we have at 2 for 1 Studios at youtube.com/2 for 1 Studios, the best place to consume the content. And if you didn't know, and I bet you didn't, we are sponsored by Kapow Comics, located at 4047 East Kill Avenue in Sherwood, Arkansas. There they have comic books, collectibles, graphic novels, and of course special guest appearances throughout the year. Kapow. All right. Guys,
I just drove by Kapow like a week ago. I didn't know where it was, and then there it was, and I knew.
Yep.
Because
there
of
you
this.
go.
So yeah.
You should have known 4047 East Kill Avenue. I say it.
I don't really know my way around Sherwood, so
Sure.
that was part of it. Yeah.
I still don't.
You
Honestly.
were like a mile from my street if you were near there.
You could have
Okay,
TP Daniel's
cool.
house. You should have called me.
Yeah,
There you go.
that was the deal.
Okay, guys, we've what was the last movie we did? Infinity War, I believe, part 1 and part 2. So we did a big giant spectacle blockbuster Marvel movie, and now we've come down and did more of a comedy, right, with Jim Carrey, directed by Peter Weirs, The Truman Show. One of my favorite movies of all time. I don't know how many times I've seen it, and I it's one of those things that every time it come on, I would immediately just have to watch the entire thing. And growing up when we didn't have all these streaming services and stuff, and watching it this time and really thinking about it, I thought, man, this movie, kind of along with the Matrix, really made me think a lot about the mechanics of what are we like involved in some type of reality show, and and maybe that's the ego part of life, right, where you think the world kind of revolves around you on some level, and you're like, well, maybe what is real, what isn't real. And so that movie really did paint a lot from my perspective. I love it. And so general thoughts before we start breaking this down. Start with Bruce. Bruce, what do you think about The Truman Show?
Yeah, I love The Truman Show too. After we did Infinity War, you guys sort of gave me choice for which movie we should do, and my first thought was to do a Peter Weir movie because, at least in my view, Peter Weir had as good a run as any Hollywood director in the 80s and 90s. I mean, if you look at when he came from Australia to the U.S., his first American movie, 1985, was Witness. And then from there, Mosquito Coast, Dead Poets Society, Green Card, not so great, but Fearless, Truman Show, Master and Commander. That's as good a 8-movie run in Hollywood as you're going to see. I mean, most of those are A+ fantastic movies.
Yeah.
So I was happy to do any of them. And of course, you guys talked about how much you love The Truman Show. And I love The Truman Show too. And it's amazed me watching it, 24 years later, how well that movie holds up. I mean, it could have been made last year and would still feel, completely current and still sort of, it was just amazing kind of how many things it sort of predicted. We still haven't even quite caught up to the version of sort of reality TV that it presents, but we're pretty close to it, I think, at this point. I mean, it's a comedy, but it's also a drama. It's inspirational. It's great. I love it.
That's awesome. Daniel?
Yeah, I love it as well. I think it's probably one of, if not my favorite Jim Carrey performance just ever in any of his films. I think it's just, this role to me marries the best that he can bring in a dramatic role and in like this chaotic, crazy, going off the rails thing that I feel like Jim Carrey was known for like kind of even like hints of Ace Ventura at times, you know what I'm saying? Just like the wackiness, and he nails it. And really, I think I don't know if this role was created with him in mind, but it feels like it could have been, or if it wasn't, he really came in there and made it his own, because it just feels perfect for him in so many ways. It feels like a role that I can't imagine another actor doing it as well in this role or doing it to the level that he does. Man, what a cast. Fantastic cast from like top to bottom. I was surprised on this watch, almost feeling how simple the movie is in some ways. I think, having watched it as a younger kid and you're kind of caught up in like the intricacy of the camera and like what's going on, especially if you're watching it for the first time and don't really know it's, trying to figure everything out. But this time I think it's a very simple, fairly short, just kind of tight film that moves along. It's an hour and 40 minutes, I think, but it feels like an hour and 15 to me. Just kind of how quickly the pace moves along, how silky smooth it just glides along, and keeps your attention, not just with like character moments, but within like, these little moments of absurd action and blocking with the crowds and different kinds of stuff. So it only reaffirmed my love for this movie, and I'm excited to dig in more with you guys.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to say much more about it, but Jim Carrey, especially for, I'm sure for all three of us, but I know me and Daniel, we grew up in the time with The Mask and Dumb and Dumber and Liar Liar and all those kind of movies. And so he really was a huge part of, our childhood, and seeing this movie just, even cemented him even more as someone that I just really loved as a performer. And, he does have those quirky Jim Carrey things in there, but it's not as much as some of his other films. And this, and kind of leading into The Majestic, and then some of his darker stuff like Number 23, or even a great movie, Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, kind of paving the way for all those. And I think he's a fantastic actor, and he's a really interesting guy, of course, if you look at him outside of the stuff he produces. But no, I love the movie, and I'm looking forward to kind of breaking it down. So I actually did my homework, Bruce. So I broke the whole thing down in the sequences, and I'm excited to kind of go through it and kind of go through how the movie works structurally and how it operates. I think Daniel's right on some levels that it not on some level. I think he's right. Like it feels so short and compact, and it feels also very, very simple in the fact that his want never changes. Like it's like very consistent throughout the whole movie. Like has obstacles, but it's so clear from the very beginning what this man wants. But let's kind of start into it. So I have this first sequence here as basically I think 15 minutes. Sequence 1, all the way from, we see him opening up, going to work, all the way to it ending with he wants to leave, and I think he's stopped by the security guards, I believe. But yeah, let's start this off. Daniel, what do you think? I have notes.
I think it's
here.
a good sequence. Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I do like the way this movie starts. I think it's a great. I do think it's a good sequence that sets up both kind of Truman's normalcy while doing these kind of cutouts to real world and kind of setting the stage. We're kind of setting up what Truman's world is, and also kind of what the real world is, the meta world in a way beyond that. And I think it does a really good job. I love all these bouncing around to these random characters. I love seeing the waitresses at the bar. I love seeing the security guards, which, when we get to the final shot of the movie is a brave choice, and I love it. I love all these little pop-ins of like finding normal people and normal slices of life mixed in with us really getting to know Truman's routine, I guess, because this movie is a lot about routines and about what happens when you change routines suddenly. There's a lot of like interesting meta analysis you could do to this movie in terms of like social or cultural kind of takeaways
and
from
religion.
Some of the ideas it's playing with.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, they set a lot of things up here. In this first sequence, we know that how his day to day goes, right? We know like the very 50s, 60s way of life that he's been presented, and how everyone's super nice to each other, and he lives almost in like this utopia for himself, right? And we see that he tries to leave. He's scared of water. We learned that he wants to go to Fiji's for somewhere because he thinks it's the best place on earth. We see product placement, which I tracked how many times we were introduced to product placement throughout the movie.
It's great. Yeah.
You know, we're introduced to Marlin, golf, and then we're introduced to a flashback with his dad, which, you know, kind of even shows more of why he's scared of water, right?
Yeah, there's some interesting things there. First of all, Donovan, you're gonna be a little disappointed because I divided the movie into acts, not sequences. So
What? Oh,
yeah.
You got
all this time I did my
Shit, Donovan.
homework.
Why didn't you
and
know? Why
I
didn't
know.
you know?
I know.
Although I think your sequences will map to the acts pretty closely, but
I'm sure they
uh,
will.
but you know, one thing I think that's really interesting about the structure, because it's not just setting up early on. It's not just setting up the narrative. It's also setting up kind of the rules of how to watch the movie. You know, Daniel, you were talking about like the hidden cameras and stuff, and I think the movie's really clever because it places the camera, you know, the film camera in all these unusual spots, right, to simulate the hidden cameras, but it doesn't stick to them all the way through the movie. You know, it will use them strategically to help remind you that this is what's happening, and then it'll kind of cut to more normal angles. Not that those angles are necessarily like not motivated by hidden cameras, but they're not all like fisheye or bizarre angles, right? They're sort of normal angles. So you get the setup of these bizarre angles, and then that sort of allows you then to have like a dialogue scene that sort of unfolds in a little more sort of traditional fashion, and then you'll get, you know, a button cam or something like that to help set you up. And then the same is true, like Donovan, you mentioned the flashback with the dad, but of course the flashback is just, you know, it's not really a flashback. It's the show like interrupting itself to remind viewers of a previous episode, right? So it's a really clever way to motivate flashbacks because it's just you're watching the 24-hour stream of the Truman Show, and the flashback is part of the show, right? Which I think is again super clever. And we should point out, as much as I've been praising Peter Weir, that the script was written by Andrew Niccol, who wrote. He's kind of like the Alex Garland of the 90s a little bit. You know, he wrote and directed Gattaca and was doing some kind of cool science fiction-y type stuff in the 90s. Did a great job with the screenplay.
That's the only thing he's written that I've seen. And I've seen In Time. That's it. I haven't seen Gattaca. Is it Gattaca pretty good?
Gattaca's his best movie as a director.
It's got Ethan Hawke in it. Heck yeah, I'm in.
Yeah. And Uma Thurman.
Awesome.
Yeah, it's great. You'll love it. It's great. Yeah.
Here's a funny thing. What if he was thinking about like the best sandwich he ate like 2 weeks ago, and they showed a flashback of, you know, his dad or whatever. You know, like, I mean, part of that is also is Christoph. He knows Truman. He claims he does better than he does himself. Obviously, he doesn't. But you know, it's him inferring, I guess, that he's thinking about the time of his dad and that kind of stuff. But there's always that, like, well, what is he actually thinking? We don't really know. It's just the show presenting us this is a possible flashback, which I think is interesting. There's nothing there, but I think it's interesting. But, you know, you're right. It sets up the world. It sets up all the players. We said his wife, his best friend, Marlin. I don't think we see Sylvie in this yet, right? I don't think we do in this opening. I call it first 15 minutes of this opening sequence. I don't think we see that, but
no, that's later. They do the later flashback.
Okay. Yeah, I mean it's
they do it. Was it 2 or 3 times? They do the flat, and just to add on to that, I really love again when we pop out to the characters commenting on the flashback. I think that for one, how he kind of establishes it helps to remind us that this is actually happening in the meta world. Or the non-meta world inside the world. There's layers of reality here. There's our reality, then there's the meta reality. But yeah, I really like to think that waitress when she's watching it and she's explaining it to someone else, he's like, "Don't you have the box set at home?" It's just you know, it's wonderful. It feels so real to people that, you know, obsess over these kinds of things and yeah. Anyway.
Donovan, I was going to ask you, do you have this first sequence ending when his dad shows up?
Yes, I the first sequence, it ends right before his dad intervenes, starts sequence 2, in my opinion. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, kind of like it's setting up, you know, the whole idea that his world, he wants to leave, and his dad sets up a whole new like conflict, right? That's kind of how I put it. And then for me, sequence 2 kind of ends with the first sequence we just see the security guards in the outside world, right? They're watching the show, and then to me the second sequence we see the waitresses twice, and it kind of ends with him doing Sylvie, that whole flashback, come find me in Fiji, and sequence 2 for me ended with the line, how's it going to end, with whatever. But anyway, yeah, no, I started sequence 2 with his dad showing up, right, which is pretty incredible. This people sneaking in the show, and yeah, it's awesome. It's awesome.
One of the reasons I ask you that is because I think another really interesting and challenging thing about the movie is the goal that Truman has, and then the goals that the Truman Show creates for Truman. You know what I mean? It's so like, you said that, he has the same goal from the start, which is basically like figure out the truth, like figure out what's going on with his life, because he has the feeling, right, that something's not right. Mm-hmm. And almost immediately, like 3 minutes into the movie, the light falls off presumably one of the lights from the dome falls off and lands in the street, and he sees it, right? So like, even though we probably presume that there's been other weird things he's noticed before that, in a way that's like the inciting incident for us. Like, he sees something that's not right, and it begins for us to see him tracking these different things that just don't quite make sense, right? And then he hears on the radio that it was a part that fell off an airplane.
Which he kind of accepts. I guess that,
he does.
I kind of feel like, I do kind of feel like that moment is more for us as the, it's he kind of accepts that, and I kind of see it like, because I do kind of feel like his goals change a little bit. I think at first his goal is to leave the town, and I don't think in the context of believing it's real. His goal is to change. Yes. Sure. He's tired of his life. He's tired of the same old, and he wants something new.
Right.
And that doesn't change for me until the world around him really starts to show its cracks. And that's when it's less about, oh, I want a new change of life. It's like, I need to know what the fuck's going on around here, and I want to get out. Kind of,
I think, but I think those things are hard to separate, because, even at the end of Act 1, depending on where you put it, like I generally agree that the whole flashback to Sylvia and then her being kidnapped is kind of the climax, but it's sort of the climax of the act or the sequence within the Truman Show, right? Because right after that, we get almost another climax, which is more the climax for what Truman is going through, which is his radio goes haywire, and he hears the back channel broadcast of what everyone's doing, and then he immediately parks his car, and at that point, like, he begins to become suspicious, right? And that, so for that Act 2 goal, I said figure out if he's paranoid. That's what I put for like an Act 2 goal. So there's sort of an in between, right? There's sort of this like, I need to escape this place because I don't want to be here, and part of it's just this wanderlust that he has, but part of it is also like something doesn't feel right, So I think both of those things are driving him. It's just that as the movie progresses, it goes from one to the other, right? At the beginning, it's more he just wants to leave and see the world, and as we find out, maybe he wants to find Sylvia. And then as the movie progresses, it's less that and more something's not right here. Someone else is controlling this. I don't know what's going on. This doesn't make any sense. I need to get out so I can figure it out, right? And it's really clever how the movie balances those things for Truman.
He's a character that's he wants to go ultimately on an adventure, right? He's a character that's like called to action, like if something inside of himself. He wants to go on an adventure. And what I think is interesting is I bet money that, and granted this is me inferring, but like I bet there has been probably even more incidences of the show failing around him. You would assume that in the early stages it's more clunky things happening as they're getting better technology and as they're getting better at their jobs. And so he talks about this later as how his, he's like, you hate me, you don't even like me, and talking to his wife, his relationship. Of course, he longs for Sylvie. all these things start kind of bubbling up inside of him. And it's like dating a girl for a long time, right? At the very beginning, you have the honeymoon period, and then after a little bit, you're like, wait a minute, they might, if you're not attracted to them anymore, or if you don't get along or you have fights, they may look less attractive. You may start seeing some flaws in the system, kind of thing, things that kind of pop out to you at the beginning. And I suspect that's what happened with him. Like he wasn't just born like good afternoon, good evening, and good night. He seems like a generally good person. Like he probably enjoyed his life up to this point, and now these things are cracking down around him. And so then he starts seeing the world cracking down around him. Again, I suspect more things happened in the past than they did even now, but the cracks are starting to show to him for the first time.
Well, it's actually the movie. Go ahead, Daniel.
I was going to say that's an interesting thing because the movie does, when they interview Ed Harris's character for like the talk show, and he's talking about the other times people have tried to invade or the guy that pops out of the Christmas present, or all these people trying to get to Truman, to tell him the truth. I think you're right. I think it doesn't make sense to assume that like the light falling out of the ceiling and then all of this stuff is the first time any of this has happened. I think that, I don't know. I guess the movie doesn't really give us any reason to believe, you think if it was like, the movie zooms in and a rat chews through a cord, there's just something that instigates, and now it's all falling apart. So I think it is interesting question of why is Truman noticing now? You know what I mean?
Well, I think the movie has some I think the movie has some built-in explanation though, which is that for one, it has a grace period of 10 to 12 years, right? I mean, from the time Truman is born, all kinds of things can go wrong when he's a child, and he'll never notice, right? For one thing, he's a kid, so he doesn't even know what the world is supposed to be. But second of all, he's a kid, so he does, they can tell him anything to explain anything bizarre. So up until he's a teenager, he probably, things can go, they had like 10 to 15 years to figure out their own model, right? And get things as good as possible. So it was sort of a clever design for how they were going to do the show that you can sort of imagine. And then, you can sort of track, okay, well then, as he becomes a teenager, you might expect him to go through some rebellion, but, obviously, we've seen in this world he lives in that somehow it's so magical and 50s-ish, as you said, Donovan, that I guess we're not supposed to believe that he's asked any questions. And it really isn't until the event with Sylvia, right, that maybe gives him real reason to sort of second guess things, not in terms of the world, but just in terms of his own life, and to start going, okay, maybe I want something different than what it is that I've wanted up till now. And what he's wanted up till now is what the show has wanted him to want up till then, right? To keep him under control. I think the big question, and I don't know if the show ever gives us or the movie gives us a sense of like how long he's been married, but obviously Meryl comes in, she's his college sweetheart. How long have they been married, right? Because I think it's from there until when the movie is taking place that we can imagine that he's going to continue to have questions, as he gets married, and okay, it's fine at first. Now maybe it's not so great. Things are weirder. He's starting to notice some things, right? And then we, however long it's been, now we pick him up, at the start of the movie.
It's hard for me to separate her character from Ozark, because I despise her so much in that show from watching this now, because I think they're both so fake, and I mean for obvious reasons. And like I like her even less now. I'm like, you don't do Truman like that, so I don't even like her. I like her even less.
I love her in both.
Yeah, I mean she's great in the role. She's doing exactly what's expected of her, and she's doing. And
there's a lot of there's a lot of crossover in her performance, but especially I don't know if you've watched Ozark, Bruce, but
I haven't.
She plays the main wife character, and there's these moments where she kind of turns on this fake nice person kind of act, and it's like it could have been a take from the Truman Show sometimes. Is how
sure,
you know what I'm saying? Like
he's very good at that. Yes.
Yes, she's good at acting in a way that feels fake, but it feels realistically fake. It's actually a pretty
Right.
intricate performance in that way, that she's having to pretend to be fake and make us believe that she's a real person faking it, and she does fantastic.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So Bruce, you say you have Act 2 starting, after we get the Sylvie flashback, right? I guess so. That's kind of where you have Act 2.
Yeah, I kind of put it after the radio goes haywire, but you could also have that be the start of Act 2. I mean, I could go either way with that. But I think there's something interesting where we sort of see sort of these combinations of Truman world elements with Truman's realizations about his world kind of being paired together, right? And so for me, like, you've got a climax that's the Truman Show climax, which is, we get this thing about Sylvia and her sort of being kidnapped and he never sees her again. And then we get a sort of meta climax where, like, he hears the transmission and now that's propelling him to, become more paranoid about the world he lives in. And I think the movie kind of pairs those things together quite a bit. And I think we'll see that as we get to other climaxes. So yeah, so for me, Act 2 becomes about, like, he is experiencing things that make him seem like he's paranoid, right? He believes people are watching him. He believes people are following him. And so now he's trying to figure out if that's the case or not.
Yeah, we get the I think it's the radio thing, right, about cracking down on. Oh no, he sees the newspaper cracking down on the homeless, right, which is reference to his dad, breaking onto the show, and question. I guess that's not his real dad at all. I guess it's just an actor, right? I was for some reason thinking maybe it might have been his real dad, and that's why he wanted to be back on the show. But now I'm thinking about it, they never say that, and it's explicit that he was an actor breaking back on. Okay, I'm working that through. I'm working my way through that.
Yeah.
So
but is the actor who played his dad? Yeah.
Right. Okay. He doesn't go back to.
Basically,
I
have like
I don't know
a
if it doubled
genuine
up or not. Sorry,
father-son relationship, or I would say that Truman has probably the most the closest to genuine relationships with his parents in the show. Maybe with Marlon too. But yeah, I mean, I definitely, it definitely was the actor, but I still feel like they do a good job of making that relationship with his father seem at least significant to him, even once he realizes, I think, it's whatever, it's fake.
Yeah, so he doesn't go to work. He starts to notice shit's not going right. He goes to the next door building, opens up the elevator, and sees it's like the crafty, right? The break room.
Yeah,
that's right.
And he ends up talking to Marlon. Marlon's like always that. Obviously, it's his guy friend, right? He gets to talk to all his feelings about and stuff. But Marlon definitely has to always come in and intervene and kind of really set him on the right track, or at least try to. And they go to the beach, right? When he talks to Marlon, and I think they talk about his job. I can't exactly remember what they talk about, and I know they watch. No, I mean
they're talking about, and that's when his dad shows back up, right? Like that's when they bring his dad back, because they have this like Truman lamenting, like, I'm feeling like I'm going crazy, and then they're like, yeah, when that started is when your father died, and then that's when they just like bring him back, and I love it because it feels so soap opera-y. It does not feel real in any sense, and I think that's what's interesting about this show, is that it's a mix of a soap opera with a reality show, even more so because there are so many people just playing specific roles, and for Truman it's reality, and for them it's a soap opera. And this is like one of those moments that just feels so perfectly soap opera-y in a way that, and I think what's brilliant about it is it gives us a reason to think Truman might just go back to accepting this reality, right? Like that emotional moment he has with his dad. And then I think that's when we go to Ed Harris's interview, where this is the first time we meet Ed Harris, I think, or Christoph.
I think you jumped ahead a little slightly.
Oh, did I?
Okay. Yeah, I think, and for me, I had another sequence here, because after he talks to to Marlon at the sunset, Marlon makes a comment of like, "Why would you ever want to leave this place? Like, right? It's beautiful. Like, it's we have everything we ever want." And then from there, we cut to he does talk to Marlon again, or Marlon again later, at the bridge with the beers. But after this part, he at the mother's house and he's looking through the family photos. This is where he discovers where she crossed her fingers when she said "I do," which is like such a ridiculous thing to do, and also I guess that makes you feel better when you're getting fake married, you know, to cross your fingers, like because that matters, you know.
But yeah, it keeps feeding his paranoia, right? And so he sees that, and then if I remember, Donovan, correct me if I'm wrong, then like he's sitting in the car when she comes home from work, and he's been observing the people circling around, right? So he seems to be in tune to the fact that this world isn't right, but of course, how would you know, right? I mean, I think that's one of the really clever things. Like, how do we, you know, because it does seem like you're paranoid, you know, that you have a God complex.
Before the you know, basically taking her on a trip, right, an insane trip. The first thing he does is he goes to the hospital to challenge her because she says she has surgery for the guy who fell down the elevator because people were in the elevator, right, with the crafty area.
Yeah.
So he goes and he questions the pre-op, and there's of course the hilarious moment where all these poor actors, right? They're like, all right, I'm gonna make the incision right here, good job, doctor. And so he sees that, and then he tries to get out like 3 or 4 times, and he just keeps having these roadblocks. He goes to the traveling agency. Of course, there's no flights for a month. He goes to the bus ticket, and the driver cannot drive stick, I guess.
Right.
Yeah, and you know, it's so weird too. It's like, of course, it's like these actors just don't know. Obviously, it's for our benefit, the audience, but these actors have no idea how to react when things are going poorly or unscripted. Because as soon as like everyone get off, they just all get up like robots and get off, right? And he's by himself, and it's really awkward and weird. And granted, maybe that's the life that he knows, that people act a certain way because he knows nothing else. But it's still obviously it's very alien to us. And then he tries to prove to his wife that there's the cycle of the people walking by. And from there, he's like, let's go on a crazy drive, right? And he takes her on the roundabout drive. He gets blocked. He can't drive over the bridge. He forces her to drive for him, which surprises her. And I think she's even surprised they got over the bridge, maybe even implying she doesn't even know how big this place is. Like, are we fixing to run into a wall or whatever? Or not, maybe she doesn't know, but it's like, it's kind of hard to, you know, if you're in a place to kind of see where things end and stop, right? And then he gets ultimately taken back to, or he goes into the wilderness, and there's those people with the radiation suits, and like, you know, there's been a spill or whatever. And then we go home, and then we get the Mokoko product placement, which is incredible. Like, who the fuck are you talking to? Like, he calls it out immediately. You know? Yeah. Then we get the knife scene. Then we get Meryl with the beers, and then Daniel. Now we get the dad reveal. Yes.
And I do want to shout out. I do love the moment when they're at the radiation site, and you think he's been talked down, and the guy has the slip. He's like, "You're welcome, Truman," and that makes him turn around, just dead sprint, you know, through the pack or whatever. It's just it's you're right, Bruce. It's a great way of just adding to his paranoia in a way that I think, and I think, you know, we're pretty aligned with him as the audience. There's not really moments in this movie where we're like, is Truman really crazy? You know what I mean? And especially just because, you know, they kind of reveal from the very beginning what's really going on here.
Well, yeah, we know he's right. They've told us that from the start, that we know he's correct, that something is wrong.
So it's more about just kind of, I think the pleasure in these sequences is, for one, just, you know, Jim Carrey's Truman is, I mean, this is kind of at his peak in this movie, is when this stuff's going on. He's just on fire. But also just watching how the world around him reacts when he goes off script, so to speak. You know what I'm saying? And I think this movie obviously has a lot of, like, you know, you could take a lot of ideas about what it's saying about reality or free will or just these kinds of things. But I think it's just a really cool illustration of just yeah, what happens, and there's things called like systems theory, but like what happens when something in the system starts going against the system and how the system reacts to it.
Right.
It's very entertaining. Yeah.
Well, one thing that's really interesting. So for me, when he fails at his attempted escape because of the nuclear power leak, to me that's the end of Act Two. And in my mind, and this is, I think, where the movie gets pretty interesting in terms of its structure and how it does things different. His goal is to figure out if he's paranoid, and I think at the end of the act, he decides he's not. I mean, he decides that there is something wrong because they have clearly, it is not a coincidence that all of these escape attempts have failed, right? He knows, I think, at the end of what I'm calling the end of Act Two, that they are keeping him there for some reason, right? So the interesting thing then for me about Act Three is that we now don't know, right? And Daniel, you mentioned that we're aligned with him, but interestingly, in Act Three, we don't know his plans, right? Like he starts doing things, and we don't know. And so, like you mentioned, he has the meeting with Marlon, and his dad shows up, and he hugs his dad. He seems to take it in stride, but it's only after the fact, when he's escaped, that we realize that he probably didn't buy it, right? That he probably knew that was a manipulation, but we don't know in the moment that he thinks it's a manipulation. But I think we can guess afterwards, when we've seen that he's plotted his escape, and he has escaped. Well, he hasn't fully escaped, but they don't know where he is. That he must have been suspicious that whole time, right? Since the end of the second act.
It's really interesting because there's definitely a shift there where I would say up to that point in the movie, we are aligned. We're seeing most everything through Truman's perspective, except for when we're popping out and seeing like real world audiences. And then at that moment, we completely shift to Christoph's POV, right?
Exactly.
From the interview.
And
we're with him the rest of the movie.
Yes.
We're
like in Act Three.
Seeing them.
Yeah, in Act 3 and even in Act 4, but we shift a lot away outside of the world, right? That's when the interview with Christoph is. We have met the other Watchers, but we've only seen them once or twice. They start showing up a lot more in the second half of the movie, especially in this Act 3. We start seeing the other characters, right, a little more. And the same happens in Act 4, especially once he's disappeared. Now we're like, we're with Marlon, we're with the other characters, they're freaking out, right? Meryl, in those scenes, like starts freaking out and almost breaking character. And so we do almost, we kind of see how this is impacting everybody else. And it kind of, it allows Truman then to execute his plan, right? Without us really knowing exactly what he's up to. We know he's suspicious, but then it's the next morning, right? And they're watching him do the whole spaceman thing, and they think, oh, it's back to normal Truman, right? And again, we think maybe he is, but it turns out we don't know, right? We don't know what he's thinking, as Donovan mentioned earlier, and we know this whole time this is all part of his scheme to then go downstairs and create his whole whatever fort so that he can escape without the camera seeing it.
Well, what's also interesting too, 100% on everything right there, but also interesting is that I think Daniel mentioned it, and we may have all mentioned it, is that these first two acts that you described, Bruce, we're aligned with Truman, and it really feels like to me we might be aligned with the real world audience the whole time, because during those two first acts, the Truman sections are from the perspective of the cameras, and we're tracking Truman. And it's not until we get like basically a special behind the scenes bonus segment, which we would be watching if we're heavily invested as the audience members of Christoph, that we switch it, because it's like we're switching channels to, oh, this is interesting now, Christoph, so we're watching that part now, which you would assume plays on the same channel. Like it's probably playing, and you have Truman in the top right, like it's always live streaming.
Well, they have that.
Shots.
Yeah, they do show that. Yeah, they have that.
Exactly.
Him sleeping. Yeah,
exactly. So it's it's like we're always the whole time in the audience perspective. Now, granted, that's a little not 100% true because we are lined with Christoph as well, right, in the third act. But no, I think it's fantastic. I do want to point out one of my favorite things in the movie, and it tells you everything you need to know about Christoph, is the moment when his dad returns, because how Christoph orchestrates the music and the cutting. He's being a director, and how he does it in real
Right.
time. He thinks he's God. Like he
Yeah.
is God in some ways.
He is.
Right, and
Truman
and
God in that world. Yeah,
and it's fantastic. I think I love the music, and I mean, Ed Harris does an amazing job, and I love it. I just want to talk about that for a second.
It's such a different role than I guess I'm used to him playing like the hardened, like action. Like I don't know. I think of him from like Westworld or like these things where he's playing like gruff, kind of. He kind of has a face of an antagonist sometimes, where he just kind of looks like a guy that, you don't want to mess with. But then in this role, he's this kind of artsy,
it's the glasses,
wannabe auteur, kind of thing that is, the hat. Exact. The hat is just too perfect. You know what I mean? It's just too perfect. But that, and then, I agree. I think that the way they introduce him with that is just it's the perfect introduction to his character. I agree on that.
Yeah, and so as you guys pointed out, I put sequence 6 or the start of Act 3 as I labeled it the truth. Right, we start seeing more viewers. We see the lunar station, the dome that's inside the moon, which is brilliant.
Right
now, it makes me think what's inside of our moon. It's like what's going on. We see the people on the show. How are you going to bring him back? The dad amnesia. It's like, oh, it's incredible. There's 5,000 cameras. Did you guys notice the sonogram? Truman's sonogram when he's a baby.
Yeah.
You guys didn't notice anything in particular about that?
No.
His penis is like as big as his entire body. You guys didn't notice that?
No.
It's such an interest. I was like, what the hell? This is incredible.
You sure that wasn't his leg? How many of those do you
I'm pretty damn sure it wasn't
his leg.
Yeah, it was his third leg, Daniel. Anyway, I was just like,
I don't know. It could be
what is going on here?
You're finding what you're looking for.
I just don't understand why they did that. You've got to look now I'm like, go look at the shot. I need to find but I'm telling you, it's wild, and like I would love to know why I will never get the answer, but I would love to know why they did that. It's like abnormal. It's as big as his head and his body. It's like, it's crazy. I wonder if it's like, is it Jim Carrey request this? I don't understand, but anyway, we get another product placement, and of course we get Sylvie calling in right to Christoph,
right?
Which he emphasizes more about. Yes, we have had people breaking on the show, and he, obviously has disdain for people who are trying to interfere with his life's work, so to speak. Which I never noticed this. It's implied, but I never saw in the background till this viewing. I've seen it like literally 30 times. There's the free Truman movements and like posters and stuff in the background, which I was like, oh, I've never noticed that. And I thought that says a lot. And it tells you the state of the world and what people are fighting for. And also, like, thank God there's some people besides just Sylvie and her interaction with him that care about. I mean, they're pretty horrible to this kid. They impose childhood traumas on him to keep him contained like an animal. It's pretty crazy. And like you wonder, I mean, granted, you would think maybe they bought this land and like declared it its own country and they can have its own laws. Like, you wonder the logistics of it. We don't get into that, but it's just totally inhumane, right?
Well, and to your point about Sylvia, I think the movie pretty strongly suggests that she got herself cast on the show to try to get him to fall in. I mean, not to say that she wasn't in love with him, but that she was, in a sense, part of the Free Truman movement almost beforehand. I mean, she doesn't go in and just say, you're on TV, but she has the little button, how will this end? She seems to be trying to catch his attention. She presumably knows that the storyline doesn't involve him falling in love with her, but she's trying to make that happen. You know what I mean? So it seems like she has an agenda even when she's first cast on the show. And then obviously that becomes more militant in terms of the Free Truman movement that we see her as a part of afterwards.
I do feel like she does love him, though. Do you guys get that
Oh yeah, yes,
Okay.
yeah, I agree. And that's why I was a little careful when I said like she went on there to, it wasn't just to like free him, but I think like she's drawn to him as a person. She cares for him, having seen him on TV. She got herself on the show, So I think she has feelings for him, but also she wants him to know the truth, right?
Also, Donovan, I looked it up. That's the baby's umbilical cord.
There's
not
no
its
way.
dick. That is literally the umbilical cord. It's like coming out of his belly button, and that's where the umbilical cord goes when a baby's in the womb.
I'm here to please. I'm here to give entertainment for this show. There's no way. I'm calling bullshit.
105.17 if you're looking in the stream. 105.17 is where the image
HBO
is.
Max up right now, and I'm going to share the screen with our viewers.
Kind of the twistiness of it, as umbilical cords do. So
proceed. I'm going to do my own investigative work real quick. No, I mean, like, real quick. I mean, obviously, we talked about this a little bit, but this kind of kickstarts us. Truman's in his normal routine. Also, I love that Paul Giamatti's in this because I love Paul Giamatti.
Oh, man.
And I love that he's in this particular role, and he's kind of the, obviously, no one wants to tell Christoph that something's bad has happened, right? And he's that classic character who, he thinks he's in the right thing, at least in the parameters in which it's been set for him, but he's obviously fucking up in Christoph's eyes, and he keeps getting shit on, which is, good humor. But
it's one of the iconic Paul Giamatti roles. Like I feel like this is his role that he plays so many times and just feels so real.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I just want to throw out an even better sort of cameo, which is we have the live keyboardist who's playing in the studio the music. That's Philip Glass, which I think is fantastic.
Who's Philip Glass, Bruce?
There's a lot. I mean, Peter Krause, who is one of the leads in Parenthood from. Wait, what did you say?
I just went like this when he said, "Who's Philip Glass?" Very famous composer.
Oh, I'm
Joel McKinnon,
including movie composer.
Yeah, Joel McKinnon from Brooklyn Nine-Nine. He's Sully, I think, in Brooklyn Nine-Nine. He's like one of the security guards. He's
I love
fantastic.
seeing him there.
Yes.
Yeah, and then you have people like Philip Baker Hall, and
yeah, in like one tiny scene, like one, he has like two.
Lines, network executive, at the end there.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, great cast. Yeah.
And then Natasha, speaking of Natasha McAlone, I guess is how you might say that.
Yeah.
She, if you're watching the new Halo series, has a leading role in that as well.
Yeah, I've seen her in those commercials. Yeah.
Yep.
Are you saying? I guess it could be his umbilical cord. It looks like a giant penis to me. Daniel.
How many baby sonograms have you looked at in your life, Donovan?
All right, I'm gonna
this one.
I'm gonna pull it up and break the tie here.
105.17. 105.17.
Hey, I'm sure you're right. My sonogram experience is very limited, especially if this develop.
I do understand it because it does have like
it's got like a
phallic shape to it. But I promise you that's the umbilical cord.
I was really hoping it's his penis because I was like, man, this is hilarious. Like, why would they do this? But I was coming for it. It's 105.17, Bruce.
That belongs in like a Will Ferrell movie, I think. Not a Jim.
Yeah.
That's why I brought it up. I was like, what?
I can see where you'd think that because it doesn't like continue this way. It presumably like curves behind itself or underneath his around his body. So yeah, I could see where you, not having seen many sonograms, might think that. But
agreed.
Welcome to Podcast 2-for-1, where Donovan sees penises everywhere. So
this is actually good though, because if you have a son someday and you like looked at the son and you're like, oh my God, he's going to be the most well-endowed child ever, and then your heart would break when you find out that it wasn't true.
Right.
You know what I mean? So
I'm
just
learning.
And then
it gives you
the person would just say, "You're having a daughter." That's what they'd say. So
exactly. I'm getting my expectations tapered already. You're right, Daniel. I appreciate it. Yeah. So I mean, we again, I love the product placement. We also have seen Meryl mowing. It's a great overhead shot of the lawnmower, right? But a big thing here is also that clearly they want to tie Truman down because they mentioned Meryl wants to have, or she's contracted, I guess, to have kids, right? So they're trying to really lock him down and to get a family going to kind of start that next chapter. And even Christoph says, "I'm determined to have the first live conception on television."
Right.
Right. He says that, and then the show actually introduces Meet Vivian. So because obviously he scares Meryl at the and she's like, it's unprofessional, all this kind of stuff, and so they're totally okay with doing everything they possibly can to. I mean, obviously he doesn't want to be married anyway, but to destroy his marriage essentially and create plot lines to bring in new people and to have him maybe try to cheat technically. And I mean,
I do feel like, to me, it felt like she was done. Like she was quitting the show after what happened. And it was more like Truman. And I think they even have something in that, like they, maybe between him and Marlon, I don't know. There's some line that's like, now that she's gone, or like she's going to leave. Or maybe it's the Ed Harris. He says like she's going to be leaving Truman soon in the show or something like that.
Yeah, he says that.
The new love interest. So I do feel like it was going to be like, oh yeah, she divorces him in the show, and then they introduce this other character.
What's my point is that they're willing to do anything to cause pain. I mean, like getting a divorce, even if I would assume. Even if you don't like the person, you still there's that can't be a completely painless experience, right? So that's what I'm saying. They're okay with constructing anything to keep him there, which is crazy, right?
Which is where I feel like I get a lot of the the kind of religious or spiritual kind of commentary, or just especially when Ed Harris is introduced, this I feel like really become like the parallels of like what the movie may be playing with in terms of like free will, or the idea of like a deity that's all knowing and all powerful and controls everything. This is when those like really start coming to like the surface, and it's like very plain kind of the ideas that the show is presenting in terms of like, basically Christoph is God and Truman is any of us, basically, and kind of like what if you could break free of God's will and do whatever you want, and what would that conversation be like? And even the way that Ed Harris is like played as like he claims to love Truman and want the best for Truman, and he's like he has such a connection with him, and he feels like his father. You know what I'm saying? And he says something close to that effect when he's actually talking to Truman at the end. I think it very, to me, the movie very clearly just starts trying to start a conversation about those ideas of free will and an all-powerful deity and stuff like that.
But I think it's a natural progression to that conversation.
Oh, 100%. Yeah, it introduces it incredibly smoothly.
Well, and I
feels
think
natural to the show and the narrative. It doesn't feel like, oh, now we're just going to have a God conversation randomly at the end of this movie.
Right.
Well, and I think what's most compelling about it to me is that it's much larger. I mean, it's not just free will and a God figure. It's also nature versus nurture, right? So, and it's interesting because the movie sort of takes a slight nature tack, I think, because he's been nurtured in the Truman Show world, right? So he should be what the world made him, but there's something about him, right, that seeks the truth, that is looking for something more, that no matter what they did to sort of program him within the Truman Show, there's something still that's uniquely him, right? Presumably something he's born with. So we get this nature versus nurture thing. And then, of course, we even get this, when you look today at like philosophy and physics, one of the main hypotheses for our universe is that it's a computer simulation, right? So you literally have, the Truman Show kind of setting up this idea that the whole world is a simulation, right? And of course, it's a TV show within a movie. So even when Truman goes through the door at the end of the movie, he can't escape anywhere, right? Because he's still inside our movie. So there's just so many levels, right? Sort of these thematic philosophical levels. Not that they're like super heavy hitting or anything. I mean, it's not, some incredible philosophical treatise, but it's just really fun that this kind of movie can also introduce all of those other things in a fun, entertaining way.
Like I said, it doesn't feel like the movie forced us to get here. It just felt like this was the natural progression of the story of Truman. If you take all that setup, this is where it would end up. Which obviously, going to the end of the movie, which I think is fantastic. Man, the end is one of the best parts of this movie in a way for me. Just the way it's just gives me chills just thinking about it.
Touching upon the simulation thing, Bruce. One thing, I watched this movie pretty young, right when it came out, and one of the things that's always stuck with me, you sometimes watching The Matrix and these other things, or reading philosophy or simulation stuff, you can go down some rabbit holes sometimes, and it can kind of create some existential crises, right? And one of the things that I always thought as a kid, and like seeing this and then seeing The Matrix, I was like, I wonder if these movies are like my white rabbits. Like, are these movies created to help open my eyes? Like, is this podcast now created from something external force to like force me to think about these things, to escape the simulation? Like, I think about that kind of stuff. You can't do too much of that, because obviously you'd be considered insane. And then also, you can only go so far with that stuff. At least right now we can. So, but I always think.
But that's what the newest Matrix did that we debated a while back.
Yeah,
that's the whole point, right? Is that the video game that he's created is the same as what you're saying, right?
I don't want to talk about the Matrix, Bruce. I
Not
did
that
buy
movie,
the Steelbook Blu-ray of it, it's limited edition, but I tried to cancel the day before, and Best Buy wouldn't let me do it, and I said, God damn it. So I ended up having
I'm sure you could still return it if you took it back to the store.
I opened it and redeemed the digital code, Daniel. I can't return it now.
Do they check that? Do they check that part?
I don't know. It's a cool Steelbook. I mean, it is what it is. Anyway, that's my Matrix problem.
Probably no one will buy it, so you'll have a very rare copy.
I hope so. I hope it's worth $1 billion. But yeah, no. So of course, I mean, the end here is pretty straightforward, right? After he escapes, the whole town starts looking for him. There's a lot of debate on whether do we send watch parties out? Do we stop transmission? They do stop transmission at one point, and the town, it becomes like the whole farce is up, right? We have the whole town looking for him. It makes no sense what they'd be looking for him this way, at least in my opinion. He turns the sun up early, which also just totally breaks character. He has everyone go to first positions, which is like, if Truman's watching this at all, then it's very much like they're just robots standing there in the streets. And you would presume maybe at that point it's like, well, they know that he 100% knows, and it's all building up to they're going to have a conversation with him, which is what we do at the end here, right? After they challenge him with the water, which is crazy because like Christoph is so worried about losing control of this thing he's created, he's willing to almost kill Truman. And
that's to me the significance of this is Christoph has built Truman a world that is run by a lot of specific rules and routines, and as long as Truman participates in those, everything's fine. But as soon as Truman wants to go off book, Christoph breaks every rule that they have. Basically, it just totally destroys the illusion to try to keep control. And I think, to me, that just speaks to kind of these ideas that we're playing with Christoph kind of playing this God role of like what happens when you go against the river, go against the stream, or choose not to go by the script, so to speak, and kind of like the stops that whoever's in charge would pull to try to keep you where they can watch you, keep where they can control you.
But I think what's interesting is that it also, I think, becomes an interesting reflection of Christoph as a person, right? I mean, he's presented sort of as this god, but you're right. I mean, his role is as solidified in this whole thing as Truman's role is, right?
Yes.
And so
Yes.
when Truman escapes, it questions Christoph's role to the point where, like you guys said, he's willing to break all the rules of the world to try to maintain his role as the controller, as the God figure, which he can't do, right? Which he fails at in the end.
But I think it's so.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was gonna say a couple things about Christoph. I do feel like he does care about Truman. He touches the screen of like Truman's face a lot, like, and maybe it's more like a subject, like a pet or something. I don't know.
Yeah.
Like he's literally, I guess he's literally petting him. Right?
He definitely.
Yeah.
But there's another thing too of I had it and I lost it. Damn. Go on.
Well, I'll say that I definitely think he does love him, but I do think it is like he loves him as a lesser than him. He sees him as like some kind of below him. But I also think what is so interesting about his character, like his whole plan with turning day to night and all this, getting everyone out of position, just, destroying the illusion, is because he thinks he can just talk Truman into staying. Like that is what seems to be, at least, like that's his final stop, right? And of course, he does the storm and stuff, and I think he tries to scare him, but like at first he's just trying to find him. You know what I'm saying? Like that's the only point of all this, is they just don't know where he is. And so
I think he's panicked.
How do I find him? Yeah, yes. But I think it's interesting that like at the end, he thinks that he feels that he
still believes it. Yes.
He's so important to Truman that he can just talk him out of it, that he can just have a conversation and just convince Truman to stay. I think that's very interesting and just says a lot about his character.
There's another thing too here, and I remember what I was going to say, is that I feel like he doesn't care so much about the popularity of the show and the success. He mentions ratings, but it doesn't seem like he does these interviews with like talk show people very often. He seems like he cares more about overseeing this world and just and playing a sim. So he's playing a video game basically, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's why he loves it. Although he also points out in another wonderful thing that everything you see on the show is for sale, a la watching something on Amazon, you're watching whatever the fashion show is on Amazon, and you can buy on Prime Video, and you can buy all the stuff on Amazon that you see on the show, right?
That's brilliant.
I also want to point out one other thing just to show like how much things sort of haven't changed and how much it's sort of predicted, which is when you guys mentioned the cutting of the transmission, right? So they discover that Truman is gone. They cut the transmission. I couldn't help but think of the Oscars this past weekend when Will Smith, hits Chris Rock. I mean, they don't fully cut the transmission, but they cut the sound. And it was like the exact same reaction 25 years later. The show is out of control. You hit the button because we got to make sure that the world doesn't see, the thing actually that's the most interesting thing that's ever happened, right? On the Truman Show, the most interesting thing that's happened in the 30 years of the show is Truman disappearing. And then, same thing with what felt like the 30-year-long Oscar telecast. They cut out the sound during the most interesting part of the show. So,
no, I mean it's very timely. I mean, you're right at the beginning of this podcast. I mean, there's not much more you can say about it. There's so many things that still happen today. I mean, like the thing is, I feel like the reality TV that we have gotten is just it's almost disgusting in a way of like just showing the worst, the worst in humans. Do what, Daniel?
I said I would not put the almost qualifier on it. I would just say it's
sure.
Straight up disgusting.
I didn't want to completely alienate Oliver Odd. No, I'm just kidding.
But
listen, some reality TV is great, like American Pickers. What was that old that show with the scientists trying to prove like movie SFX and stuff? I don't know, like that kind of stuff. Sure, but if we're talking about like exploiting children from a young age so that their parents can be rich,
I'm talking, stuff like that.
Yeah,
stuff
we've crossed a moral boundary many years ago.
But what's interesting is it also predicts whole other aspects of kind of YouTube and reality TV show culture. Like, the show is boring most of the time, right? It's got to be.
Yeah.
Like, we already know that, like, when he's sleeping, maybe they just show him sleeping. You know, sometimes, like, we saw that they have, like, the interviews with Christoph. You imagine they might show, like, highlights. But also, like, you know, right at the end there, when we see Christoph, like, the broadcast is a close-up of him sleeping, right? And that just makes me think of all of these, like, I don't know, like Asmer videos and like these calming things that you can watch on YouTube, and like these 8-hour long like waterfall videos and stuff like that. So I mean, it even predicts that aspect of, I mean, it's not exactly reality TV, but you know, the kind of images that we will watch, you know, just watching people sleep, watching people, you know, there's whole video YouTube channels, you know, with like unboxings and watching other people eat, and even watching people play video games, right? Which just sounds completely boring on one level, and yet, yeah, here it is, pre-YouTube era, 1998, predicting that people would watch stuff like that, as well as the more, you know, salacious and, you know, problematic aspects of reality TV.
Yeah,
Well,
there's even
Christoph...
videos of breaking down action figures, you know, youtube.com/2for1 studios. There's all kinds of stuff like that. So, you know, you can always check it out.
Yeah.
You know?
It doesn't, you know, going off that point where it's like Christoph, I believe in the interview, mentions like that the audience is so invested in Truman. Like the audience, the Truman means so much to them. Right. And I think we definitely get like pieces of that within, like, you know, we're following the different people. Like I love the two old grannies that are watching on their couch. And I think you're right. There is something that predicts like, and I think it's interesting because, you know, it's kind of like these people feel connected with Truman, or they're looking for some sort of like genuine connection with this character on screen. And I do think that does relate to kind of some of the trends we see now with people, you know, and especially in the world of COVID, you know, of, you know, being in isolation and finding these other ways to connect with each other. But I think the cherry on top, of course, to me, of that whole thing is the final shot of the movie, which is when it goes offline and they're like, what else is on TV? Oh, let me get the TV. And it's just a complete, just like, okay, what's next? You know, what's on TV? You know, it's just this wonderful, like, you know, underscoring that Ed Harris was just completely in his own world. Basically, the God figure had deluded himself with how much self-importance his plan and his design was. And in the end, he was just giving something for people to watch when they didn't have anything else to watch, so to speak, potentially.
Yeah, you're 100% right. And I think another big thing about that final scene, which I think it's, he gives him a one-liner at the end, everybody. That's a one-liner at the end of the movie, is his callback to his catchphrase, right? It's a one-liner.
Perfect.
So good job, people. But what's interesting there, too, is it's another situation where Christoph is, you know, he's given the speech trying to convince him. And looking at Truman, it almost feels, or his back turned to us, he's looking at the camera, looking at literally the godly heavenly sky, the voice. It's one of those situations again where you almost feel like the wheels could be turning a little bit, or we could be thinking he could think about staying. But one more time, like we've been proven multiple times throughout the movie, Truman has his own thoughts that we cannot, you know, and he even says it, like, you weren't inside my head, you didn't have a camera inside my head, which is super powerful.
Right.
And it says everything about the movie right there in that statement. And he has a big final fuck you to Christoph in a great way, and it's fantastic. So
it is. Yeah. He throws basically, because basically the idea would be that Christoph wrote that line, and through, you know, suggestion and you know, upbringing, basically ingrained Truman to say that. Right. I think the assumption is that was not Truman's creation. He was taught that catchphrase in some ways. And for him to throw it back at the creator as his final FU, I think is perfectly poetic. And just kind of this moment where Christoph is given what he in some ways wanted. You know, he went by the script one more time. You know what I mean? And I think this movie is amazing all the way through, but the ending, I think, is almost on a different level. Just the way that it and just the fact that we don't see Truman at all after he leaves. This movie isn't about what happens. It's not about, you know, him finding the girl or finding happiness. It's about him breaking out of the cycle and out of the control. And that's all we need to see or to know to finish a story. I think it's brilliant.
100%. And also that one-liner is also even more of an onion because it's got so many layers. And one of those is he's talking also to the audience, right? He's saying like he literally does a curtain call at the end. He bows for the audience. Like I've been performing this whole time for you. I'm not going to perform for anyone else, but for myself now. And it's just an amazing, it's a good onion. If I ever write my one-liner book, I may put that in there because it's a comedy one-liner. That's a great one, actually. I'm glad that we talked about this.
There's not a lot of one-liners in comedy either.
Yeah, you're right. And
or comedy
also,
drama,
I think you're right, Daniel. I think I mean, there's always been the part of me these last 20x amount of years where I'm like, man, what did happen to Truman? I don't think I want the answers to that at all, but I always wondered, what's his life like now? Like, what happened after he got out?
I do feel like there's a version of a Truman sequel that is about his life going to shit after all this and trying to get back in the show. And I don't know, you could do some really interesting things with that. And I don't think he necessarily has to get back in the show or anything, but I could see this version where we literally pick up however many years later it is, like 25 years ish from when it happened. And you've got this like strung out Truman that everything he wanted out of life went to shit, and he didn't actually know how to adjust to society because he's living in a world that was catering to him for his entire life. And so he got out and like no one gives him this kind of met with the real world, and then what his reaction is some years later. I don't know. That was a thought that I had, while we were talking.
I've had similar thoughts. Like he's almost like a child star he's super famous when he gets out.
Exactly.
And he's went through this traumatic thing. How does he deal with all that? That's a lot of trauma. That's like
basically
the rest of your life kind of
picking
therapy,
up that
right?
he can't deal with it. It ruins him or just makes him kind of non-functional in the real world society. And
he would also be like he'd also be like the old sports stars, like back from 50 years ago who like didn't make any money doing the thing they did. So if we imagine like that the Truman Show actually took place in 1998, like let's pretend like, that was the culmination of the show. And then he gets out and 20 years later, over the next 20 years, he sees all these people starring in reality shows kind of based on sort of the experience he had, like Kim Kardashian, and becoming wealthy and the world opening up for them. And he comes out and he discovers that, he was adopted by a corporation and he has no rights and he's got no money. He can't benefit at all from this. All he can do is like go to, Comic-Cons and, sign pictures of himself for, $25 a pop.
And I do think Jim Carrey could nail it. Like this older Jim Carrey we already had, like he could do it, man. There's a story there somewhere that like kind of picks up some of these same, it's got to tie back into these ideas of like free will and a God entity. And I'm sure Ed Harris would have to come back in it in some but there's a good Truman sequel in the ether out there.
Well,
I don't know who needs to write it, but there it is there. And I think if you can get Jim Carrey on board, I think it could happen.
Well, there's something also there too about it's like every reality TV show, right? Like there's going to be copycats. And so there's versions of like, they may not have been as successful as the Truman Show, but maybe there's smaller baby towns like in pockets.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? Like maybe that
every city has their own like Truman Show studio, and every state has their own like local Truman Show, program where you're watching your local Truman do his life or something.
Another interesting thing is you got to wonder about these actors. Like example, his wife seems like she's miserable there, right? And she's still following orders until Truman starts kind of fighting the system. But I mean, it seems like she's prepared to have kids with him. I mean, she's willing to have sex with him, obviously, even though she doesn't apparently like the marriage. And it's like, what's your retirement plan look like? I guess you get when you go to work, what do you actually do? I guess you go learn
My
the
assumption
lines?
My assumption was they were going to fake her pregnancy and like adopt another. But I guess that
Well, he
because
said
he wanted to have the
on-screen-
first on-screen
Yeah.
inception. Yeah, no,
Inception.
it does break down a little bit there. Like you can't imagine Laura Linney's character being willing to like have a biological child with Truman. That even if the show were to end, that's still real, and like they have to deal with that.
I don't think they ever intended for it to end until his death.
No.
I mean, like it felt like
Right.
the assumption. He even mentions a comment like, "Well, he was born on TV. He can also die on TV."
Yeah, during the storm. Yeah.
But I do agree with Daniel. I think it's hard to imagine that the actress playing Meryl, given how she sort of reveals how she feels about it all, that she would have been willing to have the baby. I mean, you kind of figure like she must have been getting paid a lot in order for her to even be
why does
willing
that
to
matter?
do that.
Because she can't buy anything super extravagant. She's got to live within her fake actress means.
Yeah. Well, I do. I mean,
Well,
her
she can
final
never
line-
leave. Right. She's not like the other characters who can get out of town and go on a 2-week vacation,
I think and her last line is maybe her best moment of she's like going on. She's like basically afraid for her life, and she's like, it's unprofessional. Like that's her like her final like conclusion of this whole thing, and it's just a wonderful like meta line, of course, of like. Yeah, there's no actor that would submit themselves to this, no one.
Well, and maybe that's as close as we get to her motivation for why she does this. She's acting the greatest acting gig in the world. I mean, she's doing something that no one else has ever done, and being the wife, is the biggest part of anybody. So in some ways, yeah, I mean, she's done something that no one else has done, but it's and whether maybe having the baby is part of the professional like commitment that she has. But yeah, when he loses his marbles, so to speak, then and it all begins to fall apart, then her tune changes. I don't know, but yeah, I
think you're right. I want to also point out, we talked about let's do a comedy, right? And this is, as I pointed out earlier, this is a much different type of comedy than Jim Carrey had done up to this point. I mean, The Mask, Liar Liar, Ace Ventura, all these movies, I mean, they're very, Jim Carrey is Jim Carrey. He's doing all the expressions and the comedic timing and just the zaniness of being Jim Carrey, right? And we get a little bit of that here, especially like when he's doing the roundabout with the car with Meryl. Yeah. Barely, but it's really more about situational humor and about the world falling apart and how the other actors are dealing with this. And I think it's very funny. It's not like laugh out loud funny. I've seen it 30 million times now, but yeah, it works. And I think it is interesting to cast Jim Carrey in this role. Based on his previous work. And I wonder if he wanted to do it because it was a little more serious and had more of a stronger message and themes to it, or if they had decided, hey, we want Jim Carrey for this. Obviously, he was a huge actor at the time, one of the biggest actors in the world at the time. But anyway, it's something to discuss. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think he very much was looking to do dramatic roles. When you look at his movies, he had done The Cable Guy in '96, which was a darker version of his comedy. I loved it too. And then he did Liar Liar, which was much more sort of traditional Jim Carrey comedy. Then he did The Truman Show after that. But then you look at the movies, he did Simon Birch in '98, Man on the Moon in '99. Back to a more Jim Carrey, Me, Myself, and Irene in 2000, How the Grinch Stole Christmas in 2000, then The Majestic in 2001. So, you could see that he very much was trying to get a lot more into drama, between Simon Birch, Man on the Moon, Majestic, did Eternal Sunshine then a couple years later, I don't think there's any doubt he was looking to do drama.
Yeah, this movie definitely, he has more of a range than anything he'd really been in up to that point, just in terms of showing pain and shock, and as well as his Jim Carreyisms, you might call them.
Right.
But, yeah.
I will say one of my favorite shots in movie history is in this movie, and it's when he puts his pencil in the sharpener and the camera goes around with the pencil.
Oh yeah.
And I just want to point out like how genius Peter Weir uses these very, very microscopic cameras with these very wide angle lenses and his placement of them. And you'd almost think like, for me, I traditionally like, a wider aspect ratio. I like things being framed that way, but I totally love this because it fits the narrative. Like those things are enforcing the narrative. Like it's constantly reminding you, hey, you're watching this as a viewer. These cameras are hidden everywhere, places where you can't see them. And I just think it's fantastic. And I just wanted to point that out because it's something that I know we talk about it in film school sometimes, but I'm not sure. A lot of people might not catch or even notice or care about when they're first watching it. There is points of reference to it, like, hey, go to camera 3 or button 3, the camera. But I think it's something to point out for sure.
Yeah, it is super clever, and again, it's very seamless. I mean, I actually just clicked on a shot that looks like a point of view shot, but you don't even notice it, right? Because it's so, we have all those hidden cam shots that when he sneaks in maybe a shot that is a POV or something that's not quite realistic to the show, you don't even notice it because his placement of those things has been so good all the rest of the time. He can get away with those key moments where he wants a more traditional camera angle. So yeah, they both balance out so well together.
I did notice one point, because one way that you could sometimes know if it was camera, sometimes there'd be like a really heavy vignette, but there was something
super
interesting
wide
that happened.
angle. Yeah.
I think it's in the car when he takes Meryl on the crazy car ride before they leave, when they're still sitting in the parking, the driveway. It kind of cuts back and forth, and they both have vignettes, but Meryl's is a white vignette and his is like the typical, black or shaded vignette. I just thought that was, and I don't know if it ever does it again. But I did notice it there that was just, and I just, I'm just not used to white vignettes just in general. You just don't see those as commonly.
Yeah.
It is abnormal. Yeah. I mean, I really like it. I mean, is there anything that you guys think in its themes or in its messages that we didn't talk about? I mean, obviously the movie's a allegory of the cave, right? You don't know what's out there until you experience beyond the wall, or beyond the wall of the cave. I personally love it just for the fact that, again, it's this character that is wanting to go on an adventure, and he's personified adventure with Sylvie, also mixed with his feelings of that one interaction he had with her that one night. But I mean, I think it makes me feel inspired, watching it, because it's like, there's something inside all of us that is calling to something more than the life that we're living right now. And Truman decides to investigate that, and it turns out that his whole world is not what it seems. And now he gets to go on the biggest adventure of his life, which is a whole new life. So that's kind of how I take it all.
I think the only thing I'd add is kind of the statement that the movie makes about the audience, which I think is really nice. So Daniel mentioned the final line where it was sort of like, what's on next? But I think it's also compelling that the audience is rooting for Truman. And they love Truman. So when he escapes, everyone applauds. Everyone's super happy. Like, they want him to leave as he's having the showdown with Christoph. They want him to leave, even though they might want to keep watching his show. They want him to leave. And so I think there's something neat about them. They are kind of against the system, right? And I think it's very accurate because they're rooting against the system, and they're rooting for people to defeat the system, and Truman defeats the system. And yet 30 seconds later, they're like, what's on next, right? Yeah. I'm still a part of the system, right? So many of them have these hopes and dreams to be something beyond the system, and yet they're still in the system. So, it leaves you on this triumphant note, but it's also very realistic about who we are as human beings and the way we both want the system to kind of be destroyed and yet are still comfortable within it. I just thought that was a nice paradox the movie was able to capture right at the end.
It's so interesting what humans choose to be not okay with. There's a billion other things happening that are just as bad or worse than this thing that's in popular media at the moment, and they focus on that, and like if we can solve that problem, then I'll be okay. But they're ignoring all these other things. You know, it's just, I mean, that's just the way at the moment humans are. So, yeah, you're right. It's interesting.
Yeah. Will Smith and Chris Rock again. Right?
Exactly. That's exactly what I was talking about. Like that right now is more important than the invasion of Ukraine. You know what I'm saying? So,
yeah.
Which is it's a awful thing. We talked about it earlier this week on 2-for-1 Joe, but you know, there's much bigger things than that. You know, but anyway.
Yeah, but the good side is that, you know, in another day or two we'll have forgotten about the Will Smith thing, and you know, we'll either go on to the next little thing or the next big thing, right? You know, and I think that's part of what the movie's saying. Yeah. So anyway, yeah.
You're right. Yeah, Daniel, any thoughts on it?
I think we covered it. I think I will say I like and I like, you know, breaking down movies that just at a technical level too, but it is to me always enjoyable when movies kind of act as conversation starters about some of these bigger ideas. And I think this is one of those that does so maybe as effectively as most any movie, like without it being something like the Tree of Life, where it's this kind of, you know, anti-plot, like we're trying to just put ideas in your head about certain things or juxtapose certain things. As a movie that really is, you know, works just as a movie. And if you just watched it and decided to take nothing else from it, it's still a great movie. But if you kind of dig a little deeper, there's some really interesting concepts being toyed at with the writing and all that kind of stuff. I just enjoy those.
Yeah, I agree. And you know, obviously we could start analyzing like super art cinema and super philosophical stuff, but that's not really the audience for this podcast. And that's why a movie like Truman Show is so great, because it is this big Hollywood movie, the big star in it. And yet, like you said, Daniel, it invites us to consider a little bit more than a typical Hollywood movie. So it sort of hits all the marks. It's entertaining, it's fun, it's inspirational, it's well made, it's thoughtful, it's a little philosophical, right? It checks like every box that you might want from a Hollywood movie. And not to, of course, I understand what we love and what the podcast is, but I do wish Hollywood, in addition to all of the, you know, the big budget movies and the comic book movies, was still making this kind of movie, you know? And
hey,
it's
agree.
bad that, I know you guys
were getting more than
we're getting these kind of
any Marvel movie.
We're getting, I feel like we are still getting things like the Truman Show, but we're getting them, I feel like they're limited series these days.
Oh yeah, they're definitely on TV. They're
like
for sure on TV.
Think of things like there was that Devs show on Hulu with Nick Offerman, which has some very similar, even just themes of free will.
Very good show.
Yeah. So I do think it's still there, but I agree with you. We don't really get the 90-minute movies about these things anymore. We get the 10-episode miniseries or something like that.
Right.
Yeah,
I agree. Severance is kind of like that, which is also directed by Ben Stiller.
Yeah. Severance is.
Which Cable Guy also has a lot of things about television and how it affects people growing up, which I think Cable Guy, one of my favorite movies of all time. We talked about this earlier, Bruce, but that, you know, it's anyway, Ben Stiller doing Severance, and that's very similar in the way of free will and what does that mean and having a work-life balance kind of thing. So I think that's also we're getting stuff like that sometimes, you know.
Yeah.
Well, Daniel, how can our listeners write into us?
Listeners, you can write into bit.ly/2for1mail and let us know what you thought of the Truman Show, if anything. I think we did a pretty darn good job of like covering this movie. You know, I don't feel like there's anything we missed, but if there is, let us know. bit.ly/2for1mail, and we'll maybe read it on the show. Maybe.
But we probably will not. Actually, we did during our live stream. Scott Eggleston, the frugal filmmaker himself, from his frugal filmmaker account, he wrote in and said, "Go watch Gattaca." So,
that's good.
He did. Awesome. So just now he did that. Okay, well,
it was during our earlier in our live stream. He did that because we're still alive, people. All right, Bruce. Thank you so much for being on the show. How can our listeners find you and all the cool things that you do?
They can find me on the web at thehutchfiles.com, where I post some of the breakdowns of the movies we do on here, and then BD Hutch on Instagram.
I'm going to make you a cool graphic later that'll pop up like ours just did. bdhutch.com.
Also, at some point, you have to have me on the show to talk about Palm Street Collective, which is Mark Thiedemann and Chris Churchill and Christy and Mindy Van Kuren and I are all working together to try to get movies made. So,
oh, is this a production company, Palm Street Collective?
Yeah, sort of a collective
Oh.
to make movies that we're all
Nice.
doing. So, yeah.
Daniel,
Yeah.
did you get
Yes,
get
we'd
your
love to
invite
talk.
in the mail, or did I didn't get my invite?
I think I was just automatically in.
Okay.
I think Bruce winked at me just a second ago, and I think
Gotcha.
that's what he meant.
Okay,
That's
well,
right,
Bruce,
yeah,
we need
yeah.
to talk after now. That's awesome. That's awesome. I would love it. We can have up to, I think, 3 or 4 guests. I would love it. Maybe if we can get a panel going on sometimes of a few of the select members on here and talk about your guys' process, what your guys' goals are, and what you guys have in the works right now. How is your feature coming, Bruce? I know we talked a little bit about it a couple months ago. Where's it at right now?
I'm hoping it'll be done this summer. The picture is basically locked, and we've got a first pass at color that I need to look at this coming week. Sound is being worked on. Got a couple of songs to lock in, but it's getting there. I'm hopeful midsummer maybe if everything goes well.
Awesome!
It
I
will
can't
be
wait to
done.
watch it.
Yeah.
And speaking of color, I finished coloring Chris Pistol's movie this morning. And you can watch that, viewers, this upcoming Tuesday, April 5th at Reynolds Performance Hall, 7 p.m. at UCA. So
Excellent plug. Yes.
Yeah, I would love people to show up
seamless.
and also support Chris Talley's movie, the Red Sedan, as well.
Yes.
Anyway, awesome, guys. I think we did it. Again, Bruce, thank you so much. I look forward to our next movie. We'll hopefully be discussing pretty soon, if not right after the podcast, what our next thing will be. And hopefully we can do it sooner rather than later.
Yeah, absolutely.
As always, my name is Donovan Thompson.
I'm Daniel Wingfield.
And I'm Bruce Hutchinson.
And we have spoken.